as you have the U.S. weaponizing the dollar and conducting real economic coercion against Russia, China, and several other countries in a related and concerted effort to preserve and expand U.S. domination, well, you have things like this. The dollar is in trouble. Countries are dropping the dollar. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they go a different route? Given if you look at the US and what's happening inside there, if you look at Germany, if you look at these countries that are so reliant on the United States in so many ways, why wouldn't you try to go independent? Why wouldn't you try? And so that's what these countries are doing. And so the share of the dollar in global reserves is the lowest in 28 years from the IMF. The freezing of Russia's forex holdings has accelerated de-dollarization around the world, says experts. The process of diversifying away from the greenback by countries around the world is gathering pace, according to the latest data from the IMF. The statistics tracked by the Washington-based institution show that the dollar's share of official gold and foreign currency reserves dropped to a nearly 3-decade low to 58% in the fourth quarter of 2022. So the dollar share of official gold and foreign currency reserves is now just 58%. The move has reportedly been gradual, and the dollar share of central banks' foreign reserves is now nearly down to its lowest level last seen in 1995. The longstanding status of the dollar in the world's dominant currency has been steadily eroded in recent years amid concerns over soaring U.S. debt. So there you go, the debt ceiling, and widely implemented sanctions using the currency as leverage. The shift was more pronounced when adjusted for exchange rates, according to Stephen Jen, CEO of Eurozone SLJ Capital Limited, as quoted by Reuters. What happened in 2022 was a very sharp plummeting in the dollar share in real terms, calling the decline a reaction to the freezing of Russia's $640 billion in gold and forex assets. Whose fault is that? That's the United States. The United States shot itself in the foot when it decided to steal Russian assets. That's a lot of Russian assets. That's almost $1 trillion of Russian assets. So how do you think the world is going to react? Especially countries like China and others that see the attack on Russia as very related to the way the U.S. approaches policy toward them. Iran, right? Much of the global South that asserts any sovereignty gets treated like this. And when they don't assert sovereignty, they get treated just as bad, if not worse, because of what friendly relations with the U.S. as a subordinate gets you. It usually gets you debt, poverty, and a whole lot of instability as well. So according to Jen, the drastic step sparked a rethink in countries like Saudi Arabia, China, India, Turkey about diversifying their reserves of other currencies. The yuan share of over-the-counter forex transactions has increased from nearly 15 years ago to 7%, according to the Bank of International Settlements. After the move against Russia, other countries are questioning, what if I fall on the wrong side of sanctions, said BNY Mellon strategist Jeffrey Yu told the media. He said global central banks are currently seeking to diversify their assets, scooping up corporate debt, tangible assets such as real estate, and other currencies. This is the process underway, Mark Tinker, managing director at Tosca Fund Hong Kong, told the agency. The dollar is going to be used less in the global system. So that's the connection. The connection is that countries are fed up with dollar dominance, and they're fed up with it because they see the writing on the wall. I mean, the writing on the wall is that dollar dominance, what does it get you? It gets you debt. It gets you sanctions. It gets you instability. And then it gets you war, right? Because the Ukraine conflict is a U.S. proxy war. It's a NATO proxy war. So all of those sanctions are part of this larger trajectory, this larger war effort. And even a country like Saudi Arabia, which had in the past been okay with waging war on behalf of the United States, for example, in Yemen. Saudi Arabia has decided that it's time to diversify, and so too has Turkey, right? So these countries that have at times played along, although I would caution ever calling those two countries straight up U.S. puppets, because they've always had a role in pulling the U.S. in certain ways too. It's one of these, it's like mutually beneficial destruction, almost like their policies and their way of approaching their respective regions. They wanted to use the United States as well. And I think that's happened in many instances. So it's not just a relationship where the US gets whatever it wants whenever it wants. And now that's being exposed more clearly as these countries decide it's time to diversify our relations and it's time to also move away from the dollar. Look at what's going on: sanctions, the debt ceiling. The United States is just not a reliable partner. And that's really the gist of it. So that's what's really driving de-dollarization. And the Ukraine conflict, of course, is at the center of why this is accelerating so much. And then you have news like this. Oftentimes this news comes in droves. And the reason why it comes in droves is because these countries are moving quite rapidly and fast. We have the BRICS summit coming up in just less than a week now in South Africa. And these countries will discuss an independent currency in which to settle trade among them and hopefully around much more of the world as countries begin to apply to BRICS. The process is fleshed out and they apply. And you have dozens of countries wanting to join. So here you have the yuan gaining foothold in Russia, says Sberbank CEO. The share of Chinese currency in transactions will rise tenfold this year, says the CEO Herman Greff. So tenfold, that's a massive increase. And oftentimes you hear US and Western-based analysts downplay de-dollarization, and you'll hear, oh, de-dollarization, it's not that big of a deal. It's very small. These currencies are still a relatively small share of foreign currency reserves worldwide. It's not going to happen anytime soon. And while there may be a bit of truth in that, it won't happen entirely. It won't be one fell swoop anytime soon. But these are the rudiments and the foundations being built that cannot be ignored, because it will happen sooner than you think if we do, and if we do ignore them. So the Chinese yuan has become a major player in Russia's trade, and its share in the country's cross-border settlements is expected to grow tenfold, says Herman Greff, Sberbank, state-owned lender, said on Tuesday. The share of yuan in Russia's export settlements jumped 2% to 18%. It's 9 times. And in import payments from 5% to 27%, more than 5 times over the past year, according to Greff. Speaking at a Russian-Chinese business forum in Shanghai, he highlighted the significant interest in national currencies in the yuan, in particular among the bank's clients. In 2023, we expect a tenfold increase in the number of transactions in yuan compared to last year, he said. Greff called Beijing's Belt and Road Infrastructure and Investment Project an important model for the development of global infrastructure. He added that Sber, as a systematically important lender in the Russian economy, would be willing to take part in the project. So I want to, before I get into more, I just want to say, Russian-Chinese Business Forum in Shanghai, even just looking at that, what does that tell you? And this comes on the heels of many different meetings that Russia and China have had in their respective countries around economic cooperation. But do you ever hear of a US, China, EU, China business forum? No, you don't. Because these countries are willing to sacrifice their economic interests to try to destroy China and undermine China. And guess who's running away with the benefits of this? It's a country like Russia, who needs stronger relations with China in order to stave off the ill effects of sanctions. So let me just go now to the 2/3 of current trade between Russia and China is carried out in their national currencies, in the yuan, in the ruble, according to the Bank of Russia. So that's a lot. This partnership is growing. They've already said, these two countries, that they're going to surpass the 200 billion watershed mark that they have made out as a goal in terms of total trade volume. But by the end of this year, they're already about to surpass that halfway through the year. So that is only set to grow. And so that means the dollar is going to be increasingly irrelevant in perhaps the 2 most important economies in the world at this point. If Ukraine didn't show you Russia's value economically, regardless of what you may think of its, if you want to call it the gas station of the world, okay, but gas stations is very important. You don't treat a gas station like a punk and expect to get treated respect, and expect anything else but problems if you need gas to run your industries. And China, of course, I mean, what is there to say about China's economic importance other than it's the manufacturing hub of the world? And it just so happens to be a driver in all of the major innovation in technology and infrastructure worldwide. So you might not want to decouple from these countries because they'll do something like this. They will find a way to survive, to live freely of your interference. And that's exactly what's happening. So the latest trading data shows that almost all of Beijing's purchases of crude oil, gas, and coal, along with certain metals from Moscow, are now settled in the yuan. A shift from the US dollar and euro in international trade has accelerated against the backdrop of these sweeping sanctions imposed by Western nations against Russia, which is a major global energy producer and exporter. The yuan surpassed the dollar to become the most used currency in China's cross-border transactions in March, according to calculations on data from the State Administration of Foreign Exchange in China. So there you have it. Now, despite being the the number one currency in terms of foreign reserves around the world, the dominant currency, the petrodollar, despite all of that, we're seeing its downfall happen quite dramatically. We're seeing it happen very rapidly. And it comes on the heels of this, you know, just utterly counterproductive approach to Russia and China. There is no cooling off. There is no cooling off or freezing the conflict in Ukraine or thawing relations with China. There is none of that, given that the policy doesn't change. And when policies don't change, then those who are affected by those policies are going to respond accordingly. And so this is all of the US and EU's and NATO. It's all they're doing. It's all of their fault. We can't be afraid. Oftentimes, even those most astute in geopolitics want to talk about this problem, want to talk about US-China relations or US-Russia relations, the collective West relations with both, as being a double-sided phenomenon, right? Like it's the chicken and the egg. Like they're both on the same plane. They're both riding the same ride. They're both problems. We had Warren Buffett recently come out and say that these two countries, US and China, are running into a cliff and it's going to take both sides to resolve it. No, Warren Buffett is a megalomaniac, profiteer, corporate financier, one of the richest people in the world. He didn't get that from working hard. He got that from exploiting hard. And here he's lecturing China that has to be on the same side as the US. They both have to come together and meet their common interests. Sure, that's true. But which side is in good faith? And the same goes with Russia. Which side is trying in good faith to change the situation? Is it the United States? Is it its collective West vassals? Is it China and Russia? Which one has shown a willingness to normalize ties, to end Cold War mentalities and policies, to cooperate to a significant degree? I think it's been Russia and China. I mean, I don't know about you all, but that's that to me is pretty much born out of the historical record. What was Putin doing for several years since he entered office in the beginning of the 21st century? Was he antagonizing the collective West? No. He was saying, hey, maybe NATO, maybe the EU, maybe we can be more integrated with Europe and the United States. Let's have good relations. And then suddenly he gives a speech in 2007, 2008, then Ukraine and Georgia being talked about being in NATO. And then you had, over and over and over again, this encirclement campaign and more countries joining NATO. And then Russia and Vladimir Putin himself said, well, I've learned my lesson. Of course, and then Ukraine happened in 2014, the Minsk Accords, all of that. And you learn lessons. Not because Putin, I don't think, already didn't know that the US and the EU and NATO aren't trustworthy, but sometimes in diplomacy and in nation to nation, this is a huge geopolitical lesson for anyone who may not know this. But in order to operate in a global situation like the one that we are existing in, you kind of have to let the reality bear fruit, no matter how much you know that the opposite may be the case. For example, as Russia, you may want to say, "Oh yeah, I'm all in with all of you guys. Let's be friends," before you antagonize in order to show people in the world that the reality is different. The same goes with China. People criticize China all the time. Why are you doing business in the United States? Why don't you get harder? And China is showing that just by trying to be close with the United States, it doesn't matter. By trying to act in good faith, no matter how bad it gets, it doesn't matter. And so that honestly, if we lived in a world where the US is control over information and international relations and institutions wasn't so firm, that would be enough to show much of the world that, yeah, the reality is quite different. And it's the US and its collective West vassals that are the blame to all this instability, the de-dollarization, and the supply chain issues, and inflation, and economic crisis hitting Europe, and hunger because of grain, bans and all sorts of things that the US and the collective West have done out of the Ukraine conflict, that, yeah, it would be more obvious. But no, we have to be on channels like this. We have to be giving this information because the propaganda war is very, very strong. And so whether it comes to this Micron technology scandal, that really isn't a scandal at all. It really is truly about China asserting sovereignty. Whether it is about this talk about freezing Ukraine or thaw with China, the US cannot be trusted. And then when we think about the impact of the US's policies, we have to think about the de-dollarization and the debt crisis, and all of this is all being related. That the U.S. in the collective West just simply cannot compete, and this is bearing more and more fruit. This is bearing more and more on the reality of the situation every single day. So blame China, blame Russia, all you want. This goes for anyone who wants to do that. It doesn't matter, because these countries will continue to go about their affairs. They'll continue to protect themselves from the worst excesses of these hostile and aggressive moves. And it will be the United States and Europe. Germany now in economic crisis, France, UK. None of these countries are doing well, and the United States isn't doing either. It will be up to them to resolve their own problems. And that will be really up to how the people respond to the fact that their leaders, their elites, their political classes are not interested. They're more interested in war profiteering. They're more interested in grander ideas of world domination. They're interested in satisfying the financiers, the bankers, and anyone who has a vested interest in war. And so it really is a decision and a choice for those in the general public, for those who are getting fed up with this reality. Do you trust the narrative that Russia and China are to blame for everything? Or is it that these two countries, along with their allies, are just going to continue to live their lives, invest, and grow stronger together? While it is the US, the collective West, the so-called model of Western civilization and full spectrum dominance and neo-colonialism that Putin often talks about, that it's this model and order that truly is dying, and it cannot be fixed in some kind of hostile hot war with two nuclear powers. That won't fix anything. That will just make the problem worse. So really, the choice is ours, and how we get there remains to be seen. How we get to make the right decision remains to be seen, how to implement it. But first, we need to understand that the propaganda war is just that.